Welcome to Brigadoon Radio. Brigadoon is the place where entrepreneurs and thought leaders discuss emerging issues shaping commerce and culture.
Hey everybody, it's Marc Ross, Brigadoon Radio, our latest episode. We're here with Kate Shepherd from the Midlands, outside Leicester, and about 2 hours north of Buckingham Palace for our friends in the US. How are things going?
Yeah, all good, thank you. Yeah, lovely to chat with you.
No, lovely to chat with you. I love the setup. It looks like you could be in Venice, California, instead of what most people think of England. Very, very modern, very clean. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's very bright. We're waiting for it to get a bit too bright, but we won't worry about the weather. That's very British to mention the weather, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I love it. So I'm fascinated by your background for several reasons, because I love the shop. One of my first jobs, like in high school, was working for the Limited brands. I was a stock boy, stocking shelves and whatnot. So that was a lot of fun. And like I said, I love the shop. I love retail. I love the high street culture in the UK. And you're also a futurist. So you're really combining, retail and trying to figure out where the world is going, which I find really interesting. So I want to ask you, first off, how do you become a futurist?
Okay. So that's a great question. So do you know what? It's a really interesting one, because I'm kind of showing my age now, but when I was studying and when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for a career, the word trend didn't exist. Like, no one was talking about trends or trend forecasting. It was a really different time. So I think I just almost like sort of just gradually kind of like what I was doing evolved into that, if it even makes sense. So I just knew I was always interested in where things were heading. I was super interested in retail design, really interested in consumer kind of sentiment, consumer insights as well. And I think over the years, then that sort of then started to blend more into, actually, if you're in that sort of space, then you're looking more at futures. But it certainly wasn't something when I was kind of studying that was even around. So
yeah, no, I think it's and there's also like blowback too, right? Like some people are like, oh, you're a futurist, like you're predicting, like, there's some kind of almost like snobbery around it. I'm sure there's always pushback because how can we actually know where we're going? So how do you overcome that? And like, especially working with clients or customers, trying to figure out, or explaining, especially potential clients, hey, this is where the world's going, you should be a part of it.
Yeah, so I've always, there's no end of quotes that I love around just actually, you should always look at consumer sentiment. You should always start with the customer, because that's going to be the thing that tells you what's really coming and what's really ahead. So, obviously now people are really thinking, what's happening post-pandemic, where are we heading to now, and I think that all of the clues lie in how we're all feeling and how actually, our mindsets have shifted and actually what we're now craving, what we've missed, the things we've realized we can do without. For me, they're all the signs of what's to come, much more so than if you were to think more notionally. I think that's always, a better foundation. And there's always that wonderful William Gibson quote that I think Greg mentioned the other day around, the future's already here. It's just not like it. I think that's wonderful because, what I do in my role is I'm forever looking at benchmarking and best practice. So, if I'm working with a beauty client in the beauty industry, I'll show them something in automotive and be like, actually, we should be looking at this because this is really where things are heading for whatever reason. And I think there's always going to be brands that are slightly leading the way. So I think that's always a good sign of what's to come as well.
Yeah, I love, one of my favorite quotes is from Henry Ford, growing up in Detroit around the auto industry. And he talked about introducing the Model T, and it's a reflection about really trying to understand like what the consumer wants, or sometimes the consumer doesn't really know. And his quote was, if I asked my customer what they wanted, they would have said, I want a faster horse. Like they couldn't envision a car, what that means. How do you wrestle with what consumers say versus what they really mean or what they're really doing? Because sometimes the consumer doesn't really know what they want.
They really don't, and I've got some really funny anecdotes. So I was doing a branch of the future study for a bank that I will not name a few years ago, and we did some wonderful focus groups where we were behind the kind of two-way mirror. They couldn't see that we were watching in, but they were being asked a really simple question. It was something, we're going back years now, but maybe it was like 2012, and the person moderating said, "Come on, it's 2020, like imagine." You know, what will we all be doing? What will we want banks to be in 2020? And they all fell silent for a moment, and they started saying things like, "I'd be able to park right outside." And then they were saying things like, "I could cash my check in less than 5 days." And everyone was just thinking this was amazing. And we were like, maybe you don't ask the customer these questions, because it's sort of like they'll only really be able to tell you just things in their immediate frame of reference. I think, yeah, it's always tricky ground, but I just remember us sort of sitting behind the two-way mirror drawing a multi-story car park with a bank on the top saying this is what they want.
As like somebody who's like studying consumer retail in the future, where do you look for inspiration? And I'm always like, for me, I'm always curious, like, you know, certain cities are cooler, or they just, you know, set the trends, or like, what is that ecosystem that really matters, or is it even explainable? Is it just something, it's just some kind of magic that happens?
Do you know, it is an interesting one. And for about a decade, I was commissioned by, it was Procter and Gamble to look at trends in the beauty industry. And every 6 months, they sent me to a different city. And it was a, you know, great gig, like literally, you know, went to Rio, went to Singapore, went to Tokyo, went to all these places. And the idea was to trend spot. The idea was to literally be on the ground in these cities, looking at what was happening in retail, but then looking more broadly as well at the same time. And it really gave me a really lovely steer as to which cities in the world actually are ahead of one another, you know, in terms of sort of doing new things first. So, you know, it was quite an interesting one. Definitely New York, you know, absolutely from a retail point of view was always just really ahead of the game, certainly in beauty retailing. And I remember Tokyo was always really fascinating, just at a very different pace of shopping. You know, and it was always a really good like benchmark to then always, we would always do the study of the city we went to, but we would always then do London as a bit of a barometer and a sense check around actually how does that compare. And it was just, yeah, it was interesting to kind of note the changes.
So those are, yeah, and you obviously working with P&G, this will be, you'll probably understand this expression. Those are very highfalutin cities, right? Or they're very kind of global cities. And then in the US, we've got an expression, you know, like, will this work in Columbus, Ohio, or will this work in Springfield, Illinois? Is there a similar, there must be a high-low kind of situation too. Like London's obviously not Newcastle, right? So how do you wrestle with that?
No, definitely. And I think, you know, certainly there's also that kind of microcosm thing going on between the different cities in the UK as well. So we would always kind of travel to the likes of, like say, Newcastle or Manchester, and different cities would be leading the way in different things. I find, you know, Manchester's got a really wonderful scene in terms of like department stores. I think what they've done in Manchester is fascinating, where they've done sort of the smaller Harvey Nichols, the smaller Selfridges, and kind of that more curated, sort of edited approach to shopping. I think they've really nailed that in that city really nicely. So I think, and also the culture of different cities comes into play. You know, some cities for me, you know, really have a very different vibe, don't they?
Yeah, no, there's certain cities, you know, I think of like, for me, it's like Los Angeles, like when you land at LAX, like you just know you're in LA, right? You're just like, this is not Toledo, Ohio. This is not New York. It's not Paris. And there's something special about these cities that really, even though there's a lot more unique, there's a lot more brands, obviously, like you can find a Nike or a Louis Vuitton or Gucci and all these various super cities, but LA, Manchester, they do have different vibes, which I think is really important to capture.
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the retailers I adore for trying to be quite locally relevant, I think that's one of the things we're going to see more and more of, is Aesop, the skincare and beauty brand. They just, in every single new location they go to, they use the materials that are local to that space. So, for example, their store, I think they've got a beautiful store in Nottingham, which isn't far from me, and they've gone into a really old kind of historical building, and they've reclaimed brickwork, and they've kind of like tried to use very traditional techniques in how they've built the space, and it's really different to anywhere you would go to in any other city. And I think I'd love to see more brands. I know it's hard, I know it's a tricky ask for brands, but I'd love to see so many more, like really trying to bring that kind of like cultural, local relevance and nuances to play. Would be really good.
Yeah, no, that's there's one of my favorite books. It's called The McDonaldization of America, and it was written by a professor at the University of Maryland. And he's basically saying, and I found this, like I've traveled pretty extensively around the U.S. and you'll find the same stores, the same experiences, and there's a lot of homogeneous, kind of qualities. And when you expand a brand, you have to do that. But we're losing, I feel like, a little bit of our soul. And I find when I travel in Europe, European cities have done just a much better job. I don't know, maybe it's just nostalgia, but just trying to capture the uniqueness of locality is super important.
Yeah, and I think I really hope, I think it's perhaps my hope as much as my prediction that I think, coming into a post-pandemic world and just everyone just having that moment of reflection, retail's been closed for the first time. I mean, when has retail ever been closed in the history of, and when things start to reopen and people start to really question what it is that they're doing moving forwards, I really hope that more retailers will bring that more thoughtful approach to, the localities that they're going into and just to reward people for their travel. I think, there's nothing worse, is there? Traveling all the way to Tokyo and being on a high street over there and thinking, if it wasn't for the signage right now, I could actually be somewhere else. Like it just, it's, as you say, the homogenization of the cookie cutter style design that you see, everywhere. It's sort of, it takes away the spirit of where you actually travel to.
Yeah, no, I think traveling from, say, DC to London to shop at Gucci, you're like, there's a Gucci store in our hometown. But anyways, let's pivot to where you are now. So you've started a new company, the Future Collective, and you just hosted a great conference, Design for Better, which is behind you, which is great. I wanted to, first, you can talk about, we'll finish up talking about the Future Collective, but your presentation at Design for Better, you use this great phrase called Enlightened Experiences, which I really loved. And this idea of kind of the cherry blossom experience, in DC, we're about to have the cherry blossoms pop in a few weeks, and, they're magical, but they only last for, 5-10 days, and a good rainstorm will wash them away. Can you talk about the idea of an enlightened experience and really, whether it's retail or office space or any kind of communal gathering, thinking about making it special?
Absolutely. So it's funny because this was an idea that was bubbling away in my mind before the pandemic hit. Actually, I started to, so obviously I work in retail design. I see so many retail briefs, and every single retail brief was asking us to create Instagrammable moments.
Right.
And I just started to question it. I started to think, is the ambition to create this physical space purely to think about through the lens of the camera that then will be shared to people that haven't even been there? And I started to think, is there not an argument for the brief being about what is it that we can design in the physical experiential space that can't necessarily be captured on camera in the same way? You couldn't just think, I don't need to bother going to that store. I can just look at it on my Instagram feed or read about it in a different way on a blog or whatever it might be. And I was reading a wonderful quote. I forget the guy's name, but he literally likened, luxury experiences he was talking about, saying, shall we just think about them in a different way? Shall we think about them as these perishable moments rather than Instagrammable? They're moments that actually, you saw them or you didn't. They're never going to be repeated. And for those that actually bothered to go, the reward in being there in the here and now is really strong. And I think, it's a really interesting concept for brands and retailers to think about, is creating that sort of rarity, that scarcity, rarity, reward, all those kind of things. I think could be really important.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a huge fan of that. Obviously, the whole ethos behind Brigadoon, for example, it's a mystical place, the moment in time. All the events we do generally, we don't record them, and you have to be in the room, which is horrible from a marketing experience, maybe, because you can't share it. But it puts a premium on saying you have to be in the room to kind of experience this, and it makes it special. So I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and I remember David Hyatt talking about that the other day, wasn't he? He was saying he wanted to go to the Patagonia talk and was saying, well, can I just watch it another time? And they were saying, well, actually, no. And I remember him saying that was the same with some of his Do Lecture stuff, is, you really do actually reward people for being there. I think.
Yeah, no, and I think, and that's got to be a tough sell, because obviously, brands are trying to scale up and you're making investments, and that can't be an easy thing for companies to recognize. But I love that idea about that's where we're going.
Yeah, I do too. And I think, we've craved physical experiences so much, haven't we? We've all been locked in the four walls of our home for far too long. And I think actually, when we step back out and we're able to experience things again, I think, there's going to be an element of just, what could we play with in that space that could be really rewarding for people.
I want to also talk to you about kind of the full sensory experience. I'm a huge fan of Thomas Pink. I haven't worn a Thomas Pink shirt in a year. I'm not sure I ever will again. But I think about when I go into a Thomas Pink store, it smells amazing. And clearly, that's very intentional. And can you talk about obviously making it the full sensory experience, how that's going to be more important going forward as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think for a long time now, design has been, to a lot of people, it's just been a very aesthetic concern. We've thought about colours, and we've thought about finishes, and we've thought about all those things. We've thought about lighting. But actually, in recent times, we've started to think about some of the other things, like whether it's the tactility of a space, or whether it's the sound or the smell or the other things that you can experience. And without a store becoming too Disney-esque, because I'm not a massive fan of it so far that it just feels a bit contrived. I do think there's something really lovely about playing with some of those moments in time. So within a customer journey, whether it's in the fitting room, if you can hear like the faint bird song or something that they do in the Hunter store so well, or if it's, I think I've referenced before, but the On store in New York talking about, actually they're trying to recreate this sense of the Swiss Alps, which I just thought was fantastic.
Yeah, I love that.
I just think there's things that people could do that could be quite playful, and again become a talking point. I always think sometimes it's the really little details that people describe to one another. They'll like tell their friends about, or they'll kind of share an experience online.
No, the small details. You were talking about even like changing rooms or fitting rooms. I think about even going to the water closet. Like, why not make that like an interesting experience? Sometimes it's like an afterthought, but it should be the entire journey, whether you're at a restaurant, a retail store, a hotel. Thinking about the end-to-end experience is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's all kinds of statistics around, I think smell. It's funny you should mention smell, because I think people are saying that that's one of the things that evokes memories the strongest of anything that you can do. So if you could like create that proper signature within a store environment, it's a really powerful thing for people. It does make them, remember things.
No, the smell, I don't know, maybe I don't know what the right word is, but I think about like the Encore Hotel in Vegas, like that smells great. Soul Cycle, the spinning studios, they've got a signature scent. It's super powerful. Let's talk about what's interesting. Obviously, we haven't been shopping as much, and there's the aspect of being in real life, in stores. How is e-commerce playing into all this, and thinking about being good both online and offline, and also delivery is becoming more and more important? I mean, do you see a trend where, how do you extend the brand to having packages land on your doorstep?
I know this is an interesting one. Matt always talks about, sort of like people in retail worrying about all these other details, but then forgetting about packages packages get flung in the bin outside your door, and actually that final mile, that final, you know, moment is actually really important, and a lot of retailers do actually forget that. And I think, you know, we've all loved it, haven't we, when something arrives and it's actually really beautiful to open, or there's just something really considered about the packaging and the way that it all unfolds. And I just think not enough people put enough thought into that element of things. And obviously with us shopping in that way more and more, it's such a missed opportunity.
So tell me about, before we close up, I want to hear about the Future Collective. You've jumped full bore into being an entrepreneur as well as, you know, trying to stay on top of what's going on in the world. How is the entrepreneurial experience going? How's the Future Collective playing out?
Do you know, it's a funny one. So I don't think that I thought earlier on in my career that I ever thought I would kind of be, you know, the owner of a company of this sort of size and what we were doing. It's more that I kind of saw something I wanted to change, if that makes sense. So sort of like working in the industry, working in the design industry for about 25 years, freelancing, as well as kind of like being somewhere permanent for 20 years. There were just a lot of things that I thought that you could do in a different way. And, you know, and it's funny because it was pre-pandemic. Matt and I, the first thing we questioned was, do you need an office? Do you need that big head office that then the overhead to people? And then we started to question around, you know, do you need lots of permanent members of staff? Because actually every brief is different, and the freelance community is amazing. Like, people don't make enough of that, I think, in my mind. Like, the truly brilliant people have gone freelance, and in a lot of people's mind there's like a stigma attached to it, but actually they're and so all of these sort of things started to connect in our heads, and we thought, well, you know, could we bring all of these things together? And then all of a sudden I found myself sort of like, okay, well, that's what we're doing. And actually it's really, you know, it's gone bananas. But I think, you know, in a funny kind of way, the silver lining of the pandemic is a funny one, because before the pandemic, people were saying, oh, you know, don't you need to be in the same office to work in that way, or you need to be around a table to come up with creative ideas. And then along came the pandemic, and nobody obviously ever asked those things ever again. And we're all on, you know, Zoom or Google Meet or whatever it might be all day, and actually the world's still turning. And I think, you know, people are realizing that actually they quite like working in their own space. That was certainly my view. You know, I realized a few years ago I do my best work when I'm not in an office environment, either being distracted for 5 minutes, getting drawn into stuff, you know. And I think a lot of people are seeing it as a whole new way. But it's certainly like, I'm really enjoying being an entrepreneur. I kind of feel like I'm getting in my stride with it now. And I think, you know, I've learned a lot from, you know, actually talking to other founders like yourself, like, you know, other people that actually, you know, have been doing it for a while. There's so much to learn from people that are kind of ahead in terms of what they're doing. So.
No, I love it. All right, before we close out, I'm going to do a speed round, 3 questions.
Okay. What's
a brand we should be paying attention to?
A brand we should be paying attention to. So I think we should be paying attention to some of the bigger brands. So for example, Futura, who they own The Body Shop, they own Aesop. They've gone B Corp recently, and I think we should be paying attention to B Corp's an easy thing to do when you're a startup and you haven't got the backstory behind you and you don't have all these things that you need to rectify. But I think it's interesting to watch some of the bigger players managing to go down that route and to make a pledge, I guess, doing things in a better way.
Favorite place to shop? Like, what's a great high street or a great kind of shopping neighborhood that we should all check out?
Oh, there's so many.
Where's your go-to? Where's your, like, you don't want to tell anybody else where you got a great pair of shoes or something?
I've always going to have a place in my heart for New York for shopping. And, you know, whether that's Soho or Meatpacking or, you know, there's just so many different places I love. But I actually can't wait to go back and do that one day. And I think it's, for me, it's, you know, it's stores like, I don't know, Dover Street Market or Mercy in Paris, or some of the ones that are more almost like a market in style. I just love those ones that are more about discovery. So.
No, I love it. They just actually lifted the restriction April 1 for even Americans to visit New York. So I plan to be there on April 2nd. Before we go, great place for a cocktail.
Great place for a cocktail. Oh my goodness me. Not Leicester. There's got to be somewhere in London. Before we go, how can people find you on the interwebs? What's the best place to find Kate Shepherd? So futurecollective.co.uk is our website. So there's a hyphen in between future and collective. And on LinkedIn, Kate Shepherd on LinkedIn. I love it. Kate, thank you so much. Maybe I'll take you for a cocktail in New York. The Bellman's Bar could be a good place, Upper East Side. We can have a nice conversation, a cocktail there, hopefully soon. It's good. Yeah. All right, Kate. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Brigadoon Radio. Brigadoon is where entrepreneurs and thought leaders gather. For more information, please visit thebrigadoon.com.